Okay, so this is the Bible study for May 16th, 2021. It's John chapter 19, starting in verse 1. And it says, Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they slapped him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I found no basis for a charge against him. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, Here is the man. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, Crucify, crucify. But Pilate answered, You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. The Jewish leaders insisted, We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you? Jesus answered, You would have no power over me if it were not given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat, a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about noon. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, Take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So, number 1 says, Why did Pilate have Jesus flogged in verse 1? See also chapter 18. So it says, Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. A, because he had found Jesus guilty. We know that that's not true. He said it in the previous chapter. He says it again in this text, that he finds no basis to convict him or to crucify him. But it's clear that B is true, because he was hoping this would satisfy the Jews who had brought Jesus to him, even brought him out in the crown of thorns and the purple robe, as if he thought, they were so angry that maybe if they saw him, embarrassed, maybe if they saw how silly this all was and how clear it was he was no king, maybe if they embarrassed him in front of anybody else who might see him in front of the crowd, then the Jews would back down and not be so insistent, because the problem they had would have been solved. And so it really seems like Pilate was doing everything possible to not do what the Jews were asking him to do, because he found no reason to do that. But at the same time, he was concerned about how the Jews were going to respond. So one of the things that it's important to understand, and if you've studied history, Rome governed a large part of the world at that time, but they also, as we know, they put Roman governors over areas, but if the people were mostly peaceful, they mostly let them govern themselves. If the people would rebel against Rome, then they had to put that down. But also, a lot of the Roman governors were, sort of political appointees, if you will. They were people who um, were friends or family of somebody that was important. And so that didn't necessarily mean they were very good at governing. They, as is also true of our political appointees, unfortunately, um, that oftentimes they're chosen not for their credentials and for their ability, but for who they are and who they know. And so so that's what was going on here. And so a lot of times the leaders of the areas were actually very weak, and not very good leaders or governors. And so they did just about anything to keep the people happy enough that they didn't rise up and cause problems. Because as long as your people weren't rising up, then you stayed out of the news, if you will. Nobody would tell Caesar about what was going on in your area. You wouldn't be replaced. You wouldn't be punished. You'd be able to continue. And a lot of these governors were more interested in living their sort of comfortable lives as Roman officials out in the different provinces than they were interested in actually doing anything. Unfortunately, that's also true of too many political appointees in our day. But so what was going on is uh, the Pilate just really wanted all this to go away. He didn't want to get all the people mad at him. If Jesus had all these followers, he didn't want the people to be mad at him. But the Jewish leaders were pretty influential among the people as well, and he knew it would be a big problem if they were mad at him and they were kind of making a ruckus. So he wanted to keep them happy, and he was doing everything he could to try to keep everybody happy, to not crucify Jesus, but also to not make the Jewish leaders mad. But it wasn't working. And so it looks like he was having him flogged and trying some things that um, maybe would have appeased them a little bit so that he could go ahead and release them and everything would be okay. But it didn't work. So number 3 says, why did the Jews want him crucified? A, he claimed to be king and only Caesar was king. So what's interesting is that's what they say in this text, but that was we obviously know that was not the reason. The Jews didn't care for Caesar either. The Jews didn't want to be ruled over by Rome. They didn't care about Roman law. They really only were trying to use Roman law to their advantage to accomplish what they were trying to get accomplished. And so in this case, that was the thing they were arguing caused him to deserve to be crucified according to Roman law. B, he claimed to be the Son of God, and their law stated that blasphemy was grounds for death. That's true. You can look that up in Leviticus, and let me just pull that up real quick, and we'll read that together here. Oh, sorry, that was the wrong version. It says, now the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father went out among the Israelites, and a fight broke out in the camp between him and an Israelite. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name with a curse, so they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri the Danite. They put him in custody until the will of the Lord should be made clear to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, take the blasphemer outside the camp. All those who heard him are to lay hands on his head, and the entire assembly is to stone him. Say to the Israelites, anyone who curses their God will be held responsible, and anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death. The entire assembly must stone them, whether foreigner or native born. When they blaspheme the name, they are to be put to death. So that's what it says in Leviticus chapter 24. So we know that that's true. That was according to their law. and they believed that's what he had done by saying that he was the Son of God. That was blasphemy against God in their minds. People are following Jesus and causing political problems for the Jewish leaders. See John 11:47 and 48. So we talked about that previously in our studies here. Um, and that was the text where the chief priest called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing? They ask. Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. So it was a political problem that he was causing for them, or at least that's part of what they were concerned with. Um, and then D, they were jealous because more and more people were following him instead of them. See John 4:1. It says, now Jesus learned that the Pharisees heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John. Remember, an argument took place, and the Jewish leaders were trying to, just before this, trying to kind of stoke the rivalry, if you will, between John the Baptist and his disciples and Jesus and his disciples. And then Jesus heard about this nonsense. And so we know that that was, they were concerned about how many people followed who, including how many people were following Jesus and no longer respecting and sort of following the religious leaders that were in place. Number 4 says, we often put ourselves in the place of Jesus in every story. I think maybe you might say, oh, no, I don't, but we like to read the story as if we're the hero, or at least as if we would have done better than the villains of the story. We would have done it better than the people that were messing up. And of course, because we can read the story, just like, when I watch one of the crime, shows that we like to watch, NCIS or whatever the mystery shows, I always know who does it. I know who the murderer is. I feel really smart. I usually guess it before they get there to guess it. But the reality is there's a reason for that. I mean, if you understand, literature or the writing of a screenplay or something like that, there's clues, there's foreshadowing. You're supposed to be seeing it. You're in fact, they only have a 38 minutes or whatever without commercials in one of these shows. So they have to give you enough information that when the killer is revealed, that that it's the right decision, which means they're presenting all of the evidence in 38 minutes. By the way, this is probably problematic for our police and our crime solvers today, because it doesn't all happen in 38 minutes, and it's never quite as easy to solve the problem. Sometimes we might think, our police can't solve all the crimes. Let's get Mark Harmon. He'll take care of it. But he's just reading a script. And the truth is that, they don't put a lot of extraneous information into so you only know the things that are supposed to be clues, which means you come to the conclusion you're supposed to come to. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out that way in real life, because there's all sorts of other evidence and it's not always as obvious or clear. And I think back to what we're talking about here, when we read the Bible, we assume that we would always make the right decision and we would always do it right and so much better than ever, because we have only the evidence that we need. We're reading the story, and the story is written in such a way that we will see how wrong these people were, and we will see how right Jesus was. Okay, it's written that way on purpose, because the Gospels are evangelistic texts. They're intentionally written that we might believe in Jesus. Okay, they're written to tell us the story in such a way that we will see the truth of it, which means that we're given the right clues, the clues we need to see the right, what's right. And it also means that if we were there, we would have been given a lot of different things, and it would have been a lot harder for us to see than we think it would have been. And so we need to start considering that we may not have been the hero in the story. So it's possible we act more like the high priest and the other Jewish leaders than we do act like Jesus. Do you ever take aim at God? Perhaps someone he has anointed to do his work, or his word or messenger. So the answers are yes or never. And all of us want to say never, but I would argue when I preach something hard, it is so often that even the people that I think love God the most, that some of them come up to me afterwards and say, Pastor, I understand what you were getting at there, but what about, and why do we do that? We do that because we don't like how that poked at our thing. We don't like how that, and maybe we're not trying to tear it down and say the pastor's the devil, or, this, we don't believe in the Bible anymore. So maybe we're not really trying to crucify anybody. But honestly, when people say things, when God's messenger, when his word says something that we don't like, that doesn't match up with our way of thinking, way of living, the way we've already been doing it, it's very easy for us to fight back against that rather than to receive it and change. So then it says, read and apply the prayer of Psalm 139, 23 through 24. So this is the prayer that says, search me, O God, and see if there be any wicked way in me. And you can go back and read that. But this is a good opportunity for us to really ask ourselves, really search ourselves and see if we ever have a tendency to push back against what God is trying to say to us, against his truth, against his word, against his messengers, against God's anointed who comes to say something to us that we don't want to hear. And it says, why do you think we are tempted to do these kinds of things? See James 4, 1 through 3. So James 4, 1 through 3 says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? I was quoting that. Let me pull that up just so that I can read it directly. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from the desires that battle within you? You desire, but do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. Now, there's talk of coveting and wanting something. That sounds like we're wanting something from someone, but more or less what it's really talking about is we want our way. Why do we fight and quarrel? Because we want our way. And when we don't get our way, we want to destroy the person that we feel is at fault for us not getting our way. Now, sometimes that is a person that stands in front of us, and honestly, sometimes that's God himself, and sometimes it's God who tells us that we can't get our way, and we blame it on the messenger or person, as if God wasn't behind that. Number 5 says, why was Pilate even more afraid, according to verses 7 through 10? So before this, they had said, he says he's a king, stuff like that. And then the Jewish leaders insisted, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. So why was Pilate more afraid? Because all of a sudden, this is not a a human thing. This guy is claiming to be the Son of God. And whether he understood Jewish religion or not, of course, everybody in the world or in that area of the world tended to know the power of the Jewish God historically. So if he was the son of the Jewish God, that would be significant. Similarly, Roman culture had adopted many of the similar gods as the Greek culture. Oftentimes it was the same gods with different names, and there were stories in what we studied in school as Greek mythology. There were stories of gods and sons of gods, offspring of gods. And so, no doubt, whether he fully understood Jewish religion or, which I imagine being the governor, he had to, or at least understand it pretty well. Certainly, this was a fearful declaration. It would have not been unusual for an official like this probably to believe in the supernatural and to be afraid if this person that he was holding as a prisoner and treating badly was actually the son of a god, let alone the God. So number 6 says, what did Pilate tell Jesus in verse 10? He said, do you refuse to speak to me? Because he came and asked him about it. I mean, he came back and said, hey, where do you come from? Tell me about this, because you didn't tell me. I didn't know. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Tell me what you're talking about. You know, you say you're the Son of God. Where do you come from? And Jesus does not answer. So then he says, do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or crucify you? So he's kind of trying to pull his authority, the card to get Jesus to recognize his authority, which doesn't work very well. He's trying to appeal to him on the basis he thinks Jesus will want mercy and will be more compliant if he realizes that Pilate's even considering to not crucify him. But how did Jesus respond to this according to verse 11? A, he told Pilate he didn't have any power over him. B, he reminded Pilate that he only has power because God gave it to him. And then C, he declared those that handed him over to Pilate guilty of sin. So he declares something that, by the way, we see elsewhere in Scripture. We see that in the book of Daniel, this concept that nobody has power or authority unless it's granted to them by God. So it's really important for us to understand, I think, when we're called to pray for our leaders in Scripture, that the leaders we have, whether they're good or whether we consider them evil, whether they're godly or not, the leaders we have been put there. God, they could not have any power or authority if it weren't for God allowing it, and he has allowed it. And so we need to recognize God's hand in that, even if we don't think that they're executing the will of God. Nonetheless, we need to recognize God put them there. Now, his response to Pilate, that's pretty bold, because it's really, I don't know, that is not going to endear him to the person who's in authority to tell them that he doesn't have any power, and the only power he has is from God. Although it might be true, Jesus says this very peacefully, without fear or without intimidation. which had to be pretty unnerving for Pilate, because it only just gives credence to the fact that he might be who he says he is. Number 7 says, how do we respond when we are in situations that seem to be completely out of our control? So Jesus is not um, physically in control of this situation. It's out of his control, yet he seems calm, yet he answers in a way that is not intimidated or motivated by his powerlessness. Because, we have this tendency when we feel powerless, if there's some way that we can wiggle out, we try to grab for it, but Jesus doesn't grab for it here. The answer might be panic and fear. It's very likely that's our normal reaction. B, anger and lashing out as if we've lost something that we previously had. So this is obviously panic and fear often cause anger and lashing out. But why are we lashing out now as opposed to at a different time? It's because we feel like we had control and now we no longer have control. So we feel like we've lost something that we had before. If we recognized before that we were not in control, then we either would have been reacting the exact same way, or we would have gotten used to being not in control and found a way to come to peace in that. But the reason we're lashing out is because we thought we were in control and now we are not. So then we get back to C, trust in God who is still in control and always has been. So if we come like Jesus to the place where we know God is in control of everything all the time, then when we're in a position where we feel out of control, there's no difference between this and what we've come to peace with at every other time in my life. And that's what I don't have control. And so can we come to a place where we have peace because we recognize we're not in control ever, and therefore when we're in a position where it's obvious we're not in control, we still have peace because we trust in the same God that was in control back when things were easy, and now he's still in control when I feel like I am completely at the mercy of someone or something. And ultimately, I'm not at the mercy of Pilate. I'm at the mercy of God himself. And if he has me here, then I can trust him to carry me through. Number 8, why ultimately did Pilate give in to the demands of the Jewish leaders? Um, they did not give up. They kept at it, and every time he tried something that he thought would appease them, it didn't work. And so it was pressure from not peers ultimately, but pressure from the mob, pressure from the crowd. And number 9 asks, do you ever give in to pressure like this when you know what is right? Pilate tried to wash his hands of the situation, but the truth is that he knew what was right, and he gave in to pressure to do something other than what was right. And unfortunately, too many of us as Christians do the exact same thing. We know what's right, but we give in to pressure to do something that we know is not right. And we need the strength of God, the help of God, the patience of God to do what is right when we're pressured to do otherwise.